them at all. Okay. Well, now, I guess, like most of you in the audience tonight, I knew Eric from very many years as a very good friend. He was an outstanding character, wasn't he? As Paul Beaver's going to remind us of that tonight. And personally, I regard myself as hugely privileged to have known him. One thing I think is absolutely certain, which is that we shall definitely not see his like ever again. Eric was a great supporter of this society, the Royal Aeronautical Society. He was, of course, our president for 1982-83, and we awarded him our very highest honour, Honorary Fellowship, in 2004. He was also a great supporter of the Farnborough Air Sciences Trust Museum down at Farnborough, where his knowledge of past events was absolutely invaluable to us, and where many of you will remember he unveiled the large statue of Samuel Cody in 2013, to mark the centenary of Cody's death in an accident on Laffan's Plain. Eric gave very freely of his time to lecture all around the world, and everyone, anywhere, who listened to his amazing adventures always came away spellbound and full of admiration. Unfortunately for all of us, many of those talks are still out there on the web, so hopefully we should be able to look at them forever. He was also a very prolific author, from his first book, Wings on My Sleeve, which was published as long ago as 1961, to his final book, Too Close for Comfort, which was published only last year. But we've come here tonight, of course, to listen to Paul tell us about Winkle's extraordinary life. Now, Paul himself is a very well-known historian, broadcaster and writer who has always specialised in air power. I first met him a very long time ago when he came into my office in the Ministry of Defence as a young reporter seeking information on the progress with the Tornado and Eurofighter programme. He later became editor-in-chief of Jane's Defence Weekly, a war correspondent for Sky News, and a studio expert for the BBC and CNN. He's a very keen pilot, and until very recently, was an officer in the Army Air Corps Reserve, which he retired from with the rank of full colonel. Personally, I can't think of anyone better than Paul to talk about Winkle, so without more ado, here he is to tell us about Winkle's life at full throttle.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not normally daunted by public speaking, but boy am I daunted tonight. Not only do we have family in the room, but we have about 8 million Fleet Air Arm ties, which is very good to see, especially if you're somebody who went to Dartmouth in May 1975, Cunningham intake, or Cunningham Division, for those of you, yellow, the good lot, you know, not that lot like Hawke at the top of the hill. And then had a big argument with the Royal Navy about whether or not I should fly or be a submariner. I decided I didn't want to be a submariner, I would fly, and because of that, I met Eric Melrose Brown, for which I've been very grateful. The little sidebar to that is the guy who was president of the Admiralty Interview Board later came to work for me at Jane's. That was very satisfying. For the next 60 minutes, I want to talk to you about Eric. I was privileged to know him for getting on for 40 years. And in the last few years, really developed that friendship. And what an amazing character he was. He never, ever seemed to tire of being informative, of talking to people. Nothing was too much trouble. It's just a fabulous man. And I'm particularly keen, or delighted tonight, that we have Glenn Melrose Brown with us, his son, Roz, his wife, and Jean, who you know was his companion in his later years. The problem with that for me is that the heckling will start a little later, I'm quite sure. But let's crack on and see how far I can get without being heckled. So these are the good facts. I mean, where do you start with Eric? Where do you start? 487 different types. That isn't including variants. There were 14 Spitfires in there and 6 Seafires. You start to add it up and it becomes a big number. And I now know the figures because I found in his own handwriting at his house last week. 2,721 launches, that isn't necessarily catapult, but it's free takeoffs as well, and the 2,407 traps. The first twin, the first tricycle, the first jet on a carrier, you can go on. 23 major accidents I found, 15 near death. That's 4 more than Neil Armstrong, including the moon. And he had Churchill come to his bedside twice. Did you know it was twice? I thought it was once, but it's twice. So, this is the sort of character we're talking about. And then there's the other bits. Wall of Death rider with a lion. Yeah, it's a good one. Berlin Olympics, of course. 1936, where else would you have gone if you were speaking German? Nuremberg Rally, arrested by the SS. Yeah, it's a pretty good one. Survived a U-boat sinking. Ditched inverted. That's quite clever. Saw the first British jet fly by mistake, and I'll come back to that. Played with the Glenn Miller band, which is why somebody in the front row is called Glenn, with 2 N's. I suppose the darker side, Bergen-Belsen liberation, that must have been an horrendous time for somebody who loved Germany, but found the darkness of the Nazi party. Flying German jets and rocket planes, interrogating Goering, arresting Himmler, debriefing the German designers into helicopters, transonic flight experiments. I don't know where to stop. The big thing is that in that period, 1936 until the 21st of February, Eric Melrose Brown, Winkle, as he was known to many people, although I was very strictly told right at the very beginning he was Eric, that he was a witness to just about everything that happened. Quite remarkable. So the other question is, why Winkle? Now, there's a lot of debate about this, and Glenn and I have been having a series of discussions, which I think are rather fun. That's Winkle Esmond there, 5'7". Happens to be Eric Melrose Brown, same height. Now, did Eric choose Winkle? Did the Navy choose Winkle? There's a lot of debate about that. Who's going to be the next Winkle? Can there be a next Winkle in the Fleet era? I think not. So I'm going to leave that question almost hanging. Esmond, of course, from a Tipperary family, although born in Yorkshire, with a Victoria Cross and a DSO for the operations against Bismarck, the DSO, and the Victoria Cross for the Channel Dash. So something for Eric to live up to. And my goodness, didn't he just? First flights, not exactly that aeroplane, but that type, gauntlet with his father sitting on his father's knee. But first flight in a bookmaster with a leading German exponent of aviation, somebody that his father introduced him to, and there are various pieces. We've got to piece together a bit more about this early flying in 1936 and why and what happened. But the key to it is, and it's in Wings on My Sleeve, which is a beautifully written piece about learning just how good some of these German pilots were, which I think gave Eric a huge respect for the German aeronautical industry, not just for the pilots, but of course also for the designers as well. And if you look at that early Germany piece, it really did shape his life, because that helped him later in the war. The fact that he spoke German, the fact that he'd been to Germany, the fact that he understood the mindset, I think allowed him to go and snaffle German jets, particularly from underneath the eyes of the Americans, which of course is very important. And my apologies to any American who happens to be here. So, yes, he did see the great man run. He was there to see that with his father in 1936. That alone is an interesting thing which you could write a whole chapter about. But he also snuck into that as well, which is reasonably good, I would have thought. He's actually third from the left, 15 row back in the picture. And obviously that's a generic picture, but it just gives you, can you imagine being a young man and being in this place and seeing all of this, speaking the language? By the way, Hitler's grammar and diction was appalling, very typical, quote, of an Austrian peasant, unquote, which is exactly what he was. But I thought that's rather good, sort of taking the time, and everyone was in awe of the Führer to critique his syntax and pronunciation. But this is the one that I really love. We're not sure. We don't know that actually is Eric, I have to say. But there cannot have been too many organizations that had a lion in the Wall of Death. The reason I found out about this is very simple. We were discussing charities, and this was about 6 months ago. And Eric said, I'll never give any money to the RSPCA, which I thought was very out of character for a man who was certainly not soft-hearted, but certainly very generous with both his time and supporting of charities. And he said, it's because of the lion. It's a great line. You have to say, tell me about the lion. And he said, well, we used to do the Wall of Death with a lion. He said, my boss his best trick was going around in a 125 two-stroke Indian motorbike with the lion on the back with his paws over his shoulders. And he said, I used to go around over the top of them and we'd go around together. He said, the RSPCA thought that was cruel to the lion. I mean, if that picture there of a lion, that lion's a very happy lion. I mean, it's like dogs with their heads out of cars, isn't it? I mean, it's just amazing. He said, I'm never going to get any money to the RSPCA as a result of that. I mean, just stopping us from doing that. We were having so much fun. I presume this was his sort of gap year job, if you like, or at least part of it. But this is where it's not the daredevil, because he was not a daredevil. Everything that he did was considered. He would have, I'm sure, considered this. He would have looked at this. He would have assessed the risks, and then he would have gone, right, I think I can do this. And another one at Lake Constance, just on Lindau, just on that border area of Austria and goes down to Liechtenstein. That isn't actually his car. But it's one very close to it. And if those of you who take that wonderful magazine Octane will have read about the car. What you may not have read, and these aren't members of the family, I should just say, I just want to get that out there straight away. But what you may not have known about the car, and this particular incident, which happened, the one that's there for real, in I think 2014, at the Yeovilton, is that he didn't want the door opened of the car because the only way to impress a girl is to jump straight in. Do you know what he did? He jumped straight in. So he would have been 95, I think, at the time, and he did that. I can't do that today. I mean, I just think it's absolutely fabulous. And nice Sea Fury there, which is currently, as you're probably aware, being rebuilt. But hey, at least it's still there to be rebuilt. Isn't that fabulous? I think the car alone is fabulous. It's just wonderful to see. But goons like these came to arrest him. If only they had known who they were arresting. They were actually arresting Flying Officer Eric Melrose Brown, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, but they didn't know that at the time. And they took him to the border and threw him out of the country with the car. And there's a great story about the car, with having an SS sergeant driving the car who was too big for the car. But the reason they didn't want the car, because it was British and substandard. And it would not fit in the Third Reich, so they didn't want it. So he got his car back, and we got one of the most incredible aviators of the Second World War, certainly in terms of test flying. Let's go back a bit from that little thing, but this isn't the first aircraft he flew. The first aircraft he went solo in was a GA-BAM, which actually crashed at Borough Green, which is just outside Sevenoaks, about 3 weeks after he went solo in it. There is no connection with that. The CAA weren't formed at the time, so it would have been, I don't know, Air Ministry probably. So I didn't know until I found a logbook of his early flying. So he got time off to go and get a civilian qualification. This is 38, remember, this is Munich, this is all of that time. And the only place that had spaces, he was in Edinburgh, remember, was down in West Malling. Ironically, 7 miles from the house which he lived in for more than 40 years. I find that really quite remarkable. And DH-60G is what he first went solo in. I do know how many hours before he went solo, but I'm not telling you because it will be in the biography. Can't tell everything. It's the Royal Aeronautical Society. So University of Edinburgh. I think he read modern languages majoring in German. There's the sort of odd bits on the web about what he read, but I think it was modern languages at University of Edinburgh. There he is, looking particularly rosy in what must be a coloured photograph, I would have thought, in that rather strange uniform there that he's wearing. When he came back from Germany in 1939, he said, "Here I am. I can fly. I've been flying in this baby here." And the Air Force said, "Frightfully sorry, old chap, can't take you just at the minute. There's a 3-month waiting list." However, the Royal Navy are very keen. Went down the road to the Navy recruiting, who said, "Come this way." As those of you who wear the tie will know, they're very welcoming. Come this way and let me take your freedom away from you. And then they said, "Yeah, but I know you can fly, but you haven't flown with us. So let's start all over again." Which he had to. Now, a little aside, which gives you an indication of the character of the man. Sydenham, which you'll probably know, is now called John, I think it's not John Lennon, no, it's George Best, isn't it? They have strange names for airports in Britain these days. Is Belfast City Airport was. He met a young girl who was at school out there and decided to show off to her by flying the Magister along the playing field of the school, and then found there were rugby posts. So, as you do, you avoid them. You open throttle, pull up, and he turned left, and there was the cathedral. So this is the first accident. Okay, so at least 3 feet off the starboard wing, and about 6 inches off the top of the cathedral. But it was wartime and perfectly acceptable. And he was in the Royal Navy. And, what more can you have if you're in the Royal Navy? No, he didn't. He wasn't the first man to fly the jet. He did fly the aircraft afterwards. But what I think is just so serendipitous about the whole of his life is that he is taking a martlet down south, lands at Cranwell because of the weather, spends the night, the next morning gets up early, and somebody says to him, "You wouldn't mind just doing a Met check, would you? Every 3,000 feet or so going up. And then when you come back, report to the tower, give us the Met, and then make yourself scarce." And so he did all this, and the controller said, "Yeah, make yourself scarce. Just stand in the back, don't say anything, and it'll be fine." What did they do? They rolled out the first jet. This must have been, and as he says in his in Wings on My Sleeve, it really was quite remarkable to see an aeroplane without a propeller. Of course, everyone knew about jet engines at the time, but they didn't know that we were this far in advance. They didn't know anyone was this far in advance to have an aeroplane which flew. And I just wonder if that gave him that little piece of impetus that said, test flying, perhaps this is what I want to do. Perhaps I could do this. And certainly the Royal Navy thought that. But before that, the world's smallest aircraft carrier, HMS Audacity. So if you're going to this isn't really an act of war, I have to say. But at the time, we were very short of carriers, so a very, very, very light escort carrier. Had been a grain ship, had really somebody just bolted some plates on the top. And of course, this was a stopgap measure to defend the convoys in the Battle of the Atlantic, the absolute lifeline of Britain, and therefore it was a target. And these brilliant pictures that Michael Turner created. First of all, the show Eric having a bit of fun with a condor. It's a fairly scary sort of interception, that, head on. But Eric told me that he'd sat down when they were on the ship with other members of 802 Squadron, and they had looked at the defensive arcs of fire of the Condor, and the only one that he thought he had a reasonable chance of intercepting was going head on with the aircraft, because everywhere else, in the beams and the quarters, the aircraft was very well defended by guns. It was a bit of a flying porcupine, as, of course, the Luftwaffe called the Sunderland afterwards. And then in December, you get sunk by a U-boat into a life raft. The great thing that Eric said was so important about being in the aircrew was you had a proper life raft, had a Mae West, which kept you, if I can do the impression, Eric's stomach wasn't quite the size of mine, but you were like that. So if you fell asleep, your head was out of the water. If you were wearing a standard Navy piece of cork around you, you went like that. And which he believes accounts for the fact that he survived and so many people didn't. That and the water. And there are lots of interesting stories about when they got back to Liverpool, because one of the things that Eric managed to do was grab his service dress before the ship sank. So when they came off the ship, everyone else was in survivor's gear, which made them look a bit like, oh, the same as the U-boat, because the U-boat was sunk 2 days later. They were also on the ship, and they came up in survivor's gear. They were all booed, including members of the Royal Navy. And Eric was still in uniform, and everyone cheered Eric. I think that's a great story. That's, again, a bit of serendipitous luck, isn't it? This is a really, really interesting story. This is really how you upset fighter command if you really want to try hard. And Brian Service, who's sitting in the front here, is one of the people responsible for Michael Turner for creating this. I have a copy of this, which Eric has written on it. It was all this is all Paul Beaver's fault, because he told me about it and I blabbed, apparently, because he hadn't told anyone about looping around the Forth Bridge. And there's a good reason for it. There are a number of boards for inquiry, including why Halifax tried to do the same. But that's a different kettle of fish, right? So this is Spitfire 5 stroke Mark 1 Seafire, and operating out of Drem. It was a secret aircraft. Nobody knew that we had navalized, would-be hooked Spitfires. Nobody knew that we were going to have Spitfires on carriers, in effect. And Eric went up and he told me that he sort of saw the bridge, and he was in an aeroplane, and it was a bridge, and it has spans. And what do you do? Well, of course, yes, you do what George Pickering did on the Winchester bypass, for example, and was followed by dozens of Polish pilots afterwards. You fly under bridges. I mean, there's an Army Air Corps pilot who flew an Oster all the way up the Thames underneath all the bridges. It was his last flight. Not because he died. But this is just brilliant, isn't it? So you do this, and Fighter Command in Scotland is on parade, standing to attention, I'm told for 8 hours, until somebody volunteers to own up to the fact that they may have actually done this. And of course, nobody did, because nobody could, because the fighter squadrons at Turnhouse and up in the north of Scotland as well, Wick and whatever, those squadrons that were then had been rested from operations in the Channel, there they were not having anything to do with this whatsoever. So what you end up having is a brilliant, brilliant piece of Royal Navy one-upmanship. Because not only do we now have the Seafire in the Royal Navy, but we've made Fighter Command stand out to attention. And you're probably aware that Eric flew Sea Gladiators during the Battle of Britain, along with 2 other acting sub-lieutenants in defence of Filton. But because they were not in a formed unit, as declared to the Air Ministry, there's no Battle of Britain clasp. Which is a fairly typical sort of piece of civil service, forgive me, Sir Don, the piece of civil service sort of structure. This is, you may have been prepared to give your life in the Battle of Britain, but you couldn't actually get the clasp because you weren't in a formed unit. Important that. I think that's fab. And it's another brilliant piece of I think there are about, Brian, there are about 3 or 4 other paintings, aren't there, that, of similar of this event. It became a bit of a cause célèbre about 6 or 7 years ago. Let's move down a bit to 1944. We've got Glen 2 ends, Melrose Brown here, because this is who is named after. Now, there are 2 very interesting stories about this. The Milton Ernest Hall in Bedford. Eric was flying at the time out of Bedford Royal Aircraft Establishment. 14th of December. That's quite important. 15th of December, this man disappears. So this is the night before the Norseman takes off to go across to France. Now, Eric said to me, okay, this is my primary source, but I have no corroborating, that he played with the band. We believe that what he actually did was stand up there with a trombone and did a bit of that, without perhaps doing any of the blowing bit. Would you agree, Glenn? I think that's... So he did sort of stand up there. But Glenn's mother, Lynn, sang with the Glenn Miller Band. Now it's in itself is just fabulous. I mean, who is one of the most iconic musicians of the period? And again, Eric manages to get invited to come and play, gets invited, Lynn gets invited to sing. She had a fabulous voice. And it just to me is, talk about getting to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, how do you manage that? I just think it's absolutely fabulous that he should do that. And we discussed the various, what happened to Glenn Miller? Was it number 9 Squadron coming back from a raid, releasing its bombs over the Channel? Possibly, time seemed to work for Lancaster returning. Or was it the fact that he was taken up by the OSS because he was so important, spirited back to New Jersey, where he died only a few years ago, aged 153. You can take your choice on the conspiracy theories. My conspiracy theory is very simple. The aircraft took off when nobody else was flying. It was really bad weather. It was December, across the Channel, and sadly it went in. And whether it went in because a Lancaster released its bomb load, or because of the weather, or the pilot flew in because no Horizon flew into the water, who knows? The sad thing was we lost Glenn Miller. The great thing for everybody else is, of course, we get lots and lots of Glenn Miller music now as a result of that, because he's a tragic hero. And, it's just quite remarkable that Eric should be there that night before. Not that I'm suggesting it's a conspiracy theory here before anyone thinks there might be. On to German jets and other aeroplanes. This is Eric's personal transport aircraft, I might even be able to make this work. I think I probably can. Yeah, the Condor. The various views of German airplanes are fabulous. Eric has written little notes in a ledger of his. He has outstanding airplanes, very good airplanes, moderate airplanes, and complete shockers. And the complete shockers are a lot of these. He quite liked the 262. Thought that was really quite a quite a smart aeroplane. And you have to say, anybody who's seen the aircraft fly, the replica aircraft that are in Germany now, it is a beautiful aeroplane. It is a Swallow. It is just, I think it's outstanding when you see it in the air. Some of the other aircraft are a bit sort of functional. There's a great story about the Bloom and Voss flying boat and about the attempt of one of the pilots to try and kill him in the aircraft in Norway when he was sent to go and see it. I just think it was just amazing. And he survived flying the Comet. I mean, just quite remarkable. They took it back to Farnborough, towed behind a Mark 14 Spitfire. I mean, that I think is just bonkers. It was Eric in 163, of course, and it was Martindale in the Spitfire. I mean, that is just, how do you do that? I mean, the Spitfire's limited. I mean, I've been privileged enough to fly a Spitfire back from Amsterdam to Goodwood. Landed with vapor, the old thing. It didn't actually conk out, and we had about. Anyone from the CIA here? We had 45 minutes to diversion of fuel, of course. But the one that I think is really, really cool is this. This is Eric on top of the Arado bomber, the 234 version B-4, which he has written on the side on this in this ledger that the aircraft, the pilot was conveniently seated very close to the point of the accident, i.e. the pilot was just there. I'm not sure that he thought this was a brilliant aeroplane, but he got to fly it. He got to fly this and some 100 other types and variants. The Focke-Wulf 190, for example, he said was a really good aircraft, but at altitude difficult to maneuver compared to the latest models of Spitfire. And the stall was shocking. One of his favourite words, shocking. A lot of shockings come out in his logbooks, which I think is absolutely fabulous. But look at it. It's a classic aeroplane. I'm pressing the wrong button. Sorry, I've just blinded the Mohammed in the screen in there. So you also have to talk about Spitfires and Seafires when you talk about any aircraft of this period. Eric was very kind to write a foreword for a book that I wrote last year. And we had great debates about how many marks of Spitfire had he actually flown. And we worked out at the end it was 14 marks that he tested and flown, including some really good flights. Like Geoffrey Quill asked him to take a Mark 8 before it had been publicly announced as a Griffin engine Spitfire, to take it down through Britain at no higher than 200 feet above ground level, and stopping at various places. He stopped at an American air base in Northamptonshire and loaded the airplane up with American rations. He was going to Chatter's Hill, which is just in Hampshire, just between Winchester and Middle Wallop, basically, which was the Supermarine test field. He said it was one of the most exhilarating flights he'd ever had because he was allowed to do whatever he liked with a new aeroplane with a quote, thunderous engine, and he was told to do it as quickly as possible. And this is the other team. This is young Squadron Leader Martindale, who, of course, has the interesting distinction of having flown a Spitfire faster than anybody else by accident from about 40,000 feet in a dive where the propeller came off, followed by most of the engine, which is really in itself quite remarkable. But this is the team, and I think this is a really interesting picture because these are the leading exponents of test flying before we actually had organised test pilots schools and the like. The Empire Test Pilot School came so much later, and Eric was an honorary member of that because he was already flying test aircraft. He was already a test pilot before anyone thought that you actually perhaps ought to put people through a Boscombe Down course in some sort. What's interesting is that Phil O'Dell, who now flies Spitfires and is chief test pilot of Rolls-Royce, tells me that when he went through the course, they were still using some basic notes that Eric had written about how you assess an aeroplane before you get into it to fly, about how you go about testing an aeroplane, that Eric had sat down and thought about and produced. Now that's the mind of the person. Here's somebody who wasn't gung-ho. He wasn't a seat-of-the-pants pilot. He was incredibly... the only time he was really gung-ho was driving a car, but most of the time he was considered and he managed the risk, which is why, of course, he lived to 97 and why, of course, he had so many aircraft types and had so many close calls or too close for comfort. This is the thing, I think, which shocked him most. And his 97th birthday party, some of us here were privileged to be in Bucks Club for his birthday. That in itself was quite remarkable. He was not 100% on his 97th birthday. But he insisted on getting up and speaking. And I thought it was very interesting. Looking back, I took notes. I used to take notes all the time. In fact, I have a series of notebooks that Jean used to comment on, and I wasn't allowed to sort of enter the house or unless I had my notebook. And then I got ribbed about having the notebook because I wrote down the wisdom of Winkle. And the thing this is the thing I think that really shocked him. Eric was deeply impressed by Germany, very, very conscious of the Germans, of their aeronautical capabilities, of the strength of character of their pilots. He really, really liked what he found in Germany. He kept his German up, although in later years, perhaps conversationally, not as good as it used to be, but he used to keep his German up, and there was a couple of people he would call and speak German to. Glenn's mother probably spoke better German than Eric, for having lived in the economy when they were in Germany later, which we might well come to. But this is the thing that really got him, was how could these people who were he really adored being in Germany, how could they do this? And so, just by accident, he had spoke better German than the official interpreters of the intelligence corps. So he was brought in to do some of the interrogations. And he said what was really interesting is that this guy, who was the camp commandant, knew he was going to be hung or shot. He knew that was it. It's index. And he didn't really. He had remorse, but he wasn't as ardent a Nazi as the female commandant was, who just didn't care. She thought she was doing exactly the right thing. And it's interesting that the females that Eric interrogated, he said, were by far the worst, and he called the female commandant the worst human being he'd ever met. And I thought it interesting, in his 97th birthday, this is something that he spoke about. He could have spoken about anything in the last, 70-odd years of flying experience. He chose to spend a majority of the time reminding people about this. But what he quite liked was talking to these people. He particularly liked talking to Hermann Goering here. He said it was really very interesting. Goering had been interrogated by American counterintelligence officers, and none of them had been a pilot. Eric was the first and probably the only pilot to interrogate him. So and because Eric was able to do it in German, they did what pilots do. They talked airplanes. And the final question he asked Goering was, who won the Battle of Britain? And Goering said it was a draw because you were having problems and we were having problems, and it was going to be who lost aircraft, the battle of attrition. Really interesting observation. He found this character wandering around in an old uniform and suggested that he might be worth actually having arrested by the Americans, Heinrich Himmler. And this lady, he'd first seen fly in 1937 in the Deutsche Halle, flying a helicopter, and had been introduced to her because his father was the British air attaché in Berlin. And they kept a correspondence up until Hannah Reich committed suicide in the 1970s. And he has, and I hope still has, but we haven't found yet, some correspondence from her right at the end where she said, and the quote is, "What began in the bunker now must end," where she had sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler. She was an absolute ardent Nazi. To get in to see Hitler, the last part of the war, she had fitted herself into the radio compartment of an FW 190 twin-seat aircraft. So it's already got a second cockpit, which it really wasn't designed for. And then there was a radio compartment. And she got herself into that. And she was probably the last person to take off from Berlin in a Fließerstorch to go up to Denmark. And Eric spent quite a while chasing her around Germany because she was a key person that needed to be interrogated, and so the Russians didn't get her as well. These are some of the guys, though. This guy in the middle, he really, really liked. Kurt Tank, the design, first of all, the assistant chief test pilot of Focke-Wulf, but the chief designer as well. And he absolutely thought that this man was a complete and total genius. And whenever you spoke to him about German aircraft, and we got on to which are your favourite aeroplanes, and it was always the Focke-Wulf 190D four-doorer, and it was because he reckons that man had made that aircraft work, because he was a pilot and he was a designer, so he was able to put both the things together. He didn't have a lot of time for Willy Messerschmitt. He thought Willy Messerschmitt, that 109 should not have been there as the principal fighter aircraft of the Luftwaffe because it was the wrong aircraft. Winkle had a much better aircraft in the 112 and the 115. But he thought, this is a member of the Nazi party who just profited from his relationship with Goering. And he didn't really have any time for him whatsoever. But he did have, of course, Eric had the opportunity to go around and talk to all these people. And as a result of that, we get lots and lots of technology ideas. We get, well, first of all, we get some wind tunnels. I'm not sure if the Farnborough wind tunnels are still extant, but they were certainly ones we borrowed and from Germany and were created across. In the Second World War, Italy had supersonic wind tunnels, and so did Germany, but we didn't. Our designers, Mitchell, classic example, didn't believe in wind tunnels, didn't see what the benefit was. Eric was a complete and total convert. Remember, his degree is modern languages. It's not aeronautical engineering. He's not an engineer, but he had the brain that could pick up what he needed to know about these things. The way that he writes and the way that he spoke really gives you an impression that he really ought to be an engineer, but not. And I wonder, just wonder, if that, what today we might call social science or the humanities, just allowed him to look at things in a slightly different way, which gave him a better way of doing these things. A few firsts. That isn't because he forgot to load the undercarriage. I just want to make that absolutely clear. That's the rubber duck, rubber dick, deck. I'll get it right in a minute. I think what's interesting about that, those of you who have flown off carriers will notice the plane guard is coming in quite close at this stage here. Normally you'd expect to see her back there, but she's coming in quite close because this is a lunatic thing to do. This wasn't particularly brilliant either. Eric's there's wonderful pictures that I found with thanks to Glenn going through some of the family albums. There's a picture of Eric climbing down from the aircraft, and a more relieved pilot I don't think I've ever scene. Very interesting, because not often did Eric Brown allow his emotions to go across his face. Just this one time, I find it. But this is completely bonkers. The landing speed is below the stall speed. I mean, 1.8 seconds if the aircraft goes asymmetric before it flips. This is just bonkers. And of course, it was all about 618 Squadron, the Highball weapon, going to Japan on fleet carriers and attacking the Japanese warships. So going into the Pacific War. Quite remarkable that you should do it. And of course, when Eric arrived back at Farnborough, his boss said, "Oh, hello, I didn't expect to see you." And he went, "Well, I was coming back. I said, I didn't expect to see you alive." Tells you something about the man. He just cracked on and completed the whole program of taking these aircraft onto ships. We needed to do this. He became such an expert that he went to America and explained to the Americans, for the Antietam, for example, how you put an angled deck on, the mirror sight. He reckoned that Admiral Campbell, who did the angled flight deck and, of course, did the ski jump for the Invincible class, was one of the greatest unsung heroes of British naval aviation. I mean, I knew Dennis Farquharson Campbell very well when I wrote my very first book. He had commanded Art Royal 4. And delightful man, lived in a converted church near Alton. And he had a very similar attitude to Eric, that you had to arrive at 11 o'clock because that's when sherry is served. And those of you who knew Eric well would have had sherry with Eric, because that's what you do. And what about helicopters? Well, his first flight, actually, this isn't his first flight, but it shows the helicopter type. It's the Sikorsky R4, was on the 4th of March, 1945. Now, Eric tells me that he and two other people, two Royal Air Force officers, went up to speak to Liverpool docks, where they had unpacked 3 of these aircraft, and he had to deliver it to Farnborough. To RAF Andover, which was then going to be the centre of all things rotary. So they do what test pilots do. They asked for, perhaps some pilot's notes would be good at this stage. Just, flip card would be good. Flight reference cards. Anyone know how to start it? Anyway, they flew them down. They got to Andover, and Eric said, and the first thing I thought was, I really do need now somebody to teach me how to fly a helicopter. He's just flown the whole length, more or less the length of the whole country. But what this did was give, being involved in helicopters, which was the post-naval career of Eric Brown, was to give him access to a lot of interesting people, particularly this guy, Sergei Sikorsky, son of Igor, the first man to hover in the VS-300. And in fact, the first time I met Eric was, he invited me to lunch. He said there'd be a few interesting people there. There were basically all the designers of all the helicopters around to lunch, including Sergei, who became quite a friend. I used to see him a lot at the Helicopter International events and the symposia and the Quad A, which was the American Army Aviation Association meetings in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. What a great guy. He and Eric really, really hit it off. And there's some wonderful reminiscences, and I think Glenn has some as well, as a young man of this great Polish-Russian family that were just as eccentric and as bonkers as you could possibly be. And a great man, which really, I think, helped Eric tremendously. Because when Eric left the Royal Navy, he went to become the DG of the British Helicopter Advisory Board, and through Eric's work and those in the industry, coordinated by Eric, we actually got rules for offshore flying. So for the North Sea, exploration for the North Sea was coming at the right time. As always, Eric was in the right place at the right time, and did a lot of work with getting helicopters in the right place. But before then, of course, as flying. I'm sorry about the resolution on this. That will teach me to steal something from the web. But display flying. There's a couple of famous little anecdotes there about displaying over the wrong airfield. It isn't just the Americans who do that. Eric led the team over the wrong airfield and displayed, and would not believe it until he landed. He also had a habit of, as a squadron commander, of marking down some of his people, perhaps more, being the only army officer who's a member of the Fleet Arm Officers Association. I have a number of times been sat next to people who will tell me that their career was completely blighted by Eric Brown, and I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, it wasn't very good," and he marked me down. A hard taskmaster, this man. I don't think I would like to as a squadron boss, but what a star. Having got the Seahawk into a position where we could display it, where it went on carriers and whatever, it became, of its time, the classic jet aircraft for carrier operations. And of course, that enabled him then to go with our German friends and the British Naval Air Mission in Germany, because he spoke the language and because he'd been to all the air bases, basically scrounging stuff, stealing stuff, liberating stuff, repatriating stuff, whatever you want to call it. He got to fly even more of these, and these are all in his logbook, all these German aircraft, Seahawk, German Navy, Marineflieger, and the Gannet as well. You may have seen there was a very interesting documentary on Discovery Channel a few weeks ago about why the Germans bought the Starfighter, not the political shenanigans and the alleged brown envelopes, but why they didn't buy the Saunders Roe, I think 1153, rocket-assisted jet aircraft that all the Germans wanted, and so did Eric, but they didn't have the political clout of the Americans. So the Germans bought the Starfighter and lost 210 pilots as a result. But I think he enjoyed this time. He enjoyed this time because it's the first time he met Her Majesty the Queen, when Britannia went down the Rhine to Cologne and was berthed alongside. There's a great picture of Eric with Konrad Adenauer coming down the steps of Britannia, and of course, it really easy for Eric. He spoke German, as did Lynn. So there was a great bonding, and I wonder whether what the questions were at the time. I mean, for somebody who had spent before the war in Germany, with Adenauer had been a political prisoner before the war, that would have been a very interesting. I'd like to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations. A person who I think probably was in later years Eric's best friend. I use that term advisedly. I really think his relationship with Neil Armstrong, which started at Farnborough in the back of a Land Rover on a Sunday, because if you were Eric, you spent 8 years testing, you didn't have a weekend off, you didn't have a holiday, you just were testing. And a Sunday morning, Neil Armstrong was doing some test flying as well. The relationship led to Eric going to Patuxent River. It led to a lifelong relationship with the astronauts. And a book is out this month called Into the Black, which is about the shuttle. And the author, Roland White, sitting in the back there. Roland interviewed Eric about this time. And what I find really interesting is, and I think, Roland, you probably back me up on this, is Eric didn't rate going to the moon as being Neil Armstrong's greatest achievement, because he said a computer took him there. He reckoned that the X-15 was Neil Armstrong's greatest achievement, because that was a pilot's aircraft. That's test flying, as far as Eric was concerned. The interesting story is that a bunch of American test pilots and astronaut candidates wanted Eric to fly the 15. After all, you'll recall that Eric was going to be the pilot of the Miles 52, which was going to be the first aircraft through the sound barrier, until Mr. Attlee gave all the plans and the aircraft to the Americans in order that they could go through the sound barrier first, and presumably we could get 0.5% off a exchange rate or something. Eric was always very, very sore about that, and some bloke called Jägermeister or Jaeger, whatever, went through first. He rated Neil Armstrong above all others as a test pilot. He thought that and as a person, he liked the person here. Eric was cleared to fly the X-15 on one condition: he became an American. That is not Eric Brown. This is a man who was prepared to stand up on Scottish television and say, I'm a Brit, there's a union here. I might be born in Scotland, but I'm a Brit. Vote to stay in the union. This is how Eric felt about this. Despite the fact this is probably the thing he really wanted to do, he was not prepared to compromise, which I think is really important. Lossiemouth in command. Remember, test pilot, he was an SL. To those of you who wearing the tie, SLs? Anyone SL shags here? Oh, yeah, okay, fine. So you know exactly what happens here in SL shag. You get ceilinged, really. He was dry list. He was not going to command at sea. And he wasn't really going to go above captain. I would not have liked to have been one of his squadron commanders at Lossiemouth when he was captain of Lossiemouth. I think that would have been, to live up to his standards, would have been really, really hard. Having said that, it's very interesting that the Navy were almost apologetic for the fact that he had to retire. I find that interesting. Now, maybe it'll just be nice letters from senior people. But I think they actually understood just how much Eric contributed. Besides being GG of the British Helicopter Advisory Board, of course, he was also a Helicopter Club of Great Britain, an international judge. This is one of the trips. This is about the time that I first met him, to Belarus to judge the slalom competition, which you can see the water. Or it actually looks like that's somebody being presented with roses. Perhaps it isn't water. Now I see the picture slightly larger. When they arrived at the airport at Moscow, Eric was sort of, if you like, in the second echelon. There was the FAI had a whole bunch of senior people. There was a Frenchman, there was an American there, and Eric was in the second sort of group. And a big Zlin rolled up for Eric. But he said, no, you don't understand, I'm just the Brit rep. There's, the boss is here, the Frenchman and the American. He said, no. We know your war record. We know what you contributed to the end of fascism. This car is for you. And I find that really, really, really interesting. And it led to this. He's an honored military pilot of the USSR. He is the only foreign person who has this decoration. I actually never saw him wear it. And in fact, this is one I've taken off the whip. I don't know if we've located it, but he was an honored military pilot of the USSR. From that, he was presented with that because of his contribution to the defense of the Soviet Union, of the motherland, in the Great Patriotic War, by his contribution in test flying. I find that really interesting. That's the internationalism of Eric. It wasn't just the Americans, it wasn't just the Germans. It spread across the world. This is probably the thing that he most liked doing, was being on desert island discs, with this Scottish lady here, whose name I can't remember, but she used to be on Channel 5, and I seem to remember doing a few turns with her, as they say in television, on Channel 5 News. But just look at his face. This is a man who's really quite enjoying his life. And this is the last year. This is this wonderful auction we had for Too Close for Comfort. We went out to dinner afterwards. And Jean, I don't know if you remember, but it was 11:45, and we had to say to Eric, the restaurant would like to close. The staff would like to go home. Could you please drink your whiskey up because we need to go. This is Brown's, who actually, I have to say, would have kept us there all evening if they needed to. He was in fine form. There he is at Biggin Hill with the president and Simon Levy from the society. We had a little dinner at Rise and Jet to celebrate the hardest day, which is when I found out that he'd flown Sea Gladiators in the Battle of Britain. And it was one of those brilliant occasions where he just stood up and talked and told us things that I must have heard him speak 200 or 300 times. Little bits came out that I hadn't heard. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. It's a great evening. And that's First Sea Lord. He's First Sea Lord for the next, 3 or 4 weeks. George Zambellis with Eric. And what he says is his favourite, or said was his favourite picture out of that collection that Tim Manor acquired at this auction. And that's in Bucks Club in Mayfair, where we had a small celebration of sort of 120 people, I think, turned up in the end. To me, that was Eric was obviously tired, obviously in some pain, but was going to talk, was going to stand up, and he was not going to let the audience down. He wasn't going to let his followers down. And I thought that was just fabulous. We found that night we had in the room the only 2 people living who've flown the Messerschmitt 262, and there are a whole bunch of other things that we had in the room. It was just a magical time. To draw to a close, this is a little limerick that I've sort of manufactured with the help of a few friends, and I'll let you read that. I think it's absolutely spot on, and it was a huge privilege to have known Eric Melrose Brown. I count myself really honoured and privileged, and to speak to you tonight has been absolutely fabulous. And so thank you for laughing at the right time, which is always important to a speaker. I think we're supposed to close that. If there are a couple of questions, can I take those, Don? Anyone like to? Because we've got a whole bunch of people here. We've got people who've known him as long as I have. We've got people here who know different bits of his life, and of course we've got family. Any questions? Anyone like to add? Oh, yeah, you all want to add, I'm sure. Sir.
I'd just like to mention again what I mentioned to you earlier, which is that when I was over at Eric's house within the last 6 months, he happened to mention that Harold Penrose was his mentor. And that may be a key piece of information. I don't know if it's recorded. It is now, and now lots of other people have got it, and I won't be able to use it in his biography. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else like to take any of my little pieces from the biography? Sir, anything you want to say that I might want to talk to you earlier about? Jim, I know where you live.
I was chair of the historical group, and we had a lecture on the post-war exhibition of German aircraft at Farnborough in this room. And Winkle, Eric Brown, came along, and after the lecture, he gave a little impromptu talk about actually flying them, and it just made the evening, and has made it an evening that none of us who were there would ever forget. That was absolutely typical.
And do you know what's interesting is that is not the only time. I think every time Eric spoke to a group, and he always had time for the Shoreham Aviation Museum or the Smallfield Aviation Society or whomsoever it was. He always had time for people and to stand up and talk to them. I mean, a man of huge energy. And I find it really, really sad that we've lost that one person. As Don says, there'll never be his like again. He lived through that key place in aeronautics, that key period from 1936 to the present day, where he just about saw everything happen. Seeing Hitler twice, critiquing his syntax, I think it's fabulous. Interviewing all the senior Germans. Knowing all of the astronauts. These are These are all fundamental things. 487 types of aeroplane. Nobody will ever do that again because most of these airplanes no longer fly. Or we don't even have exhibits and examples in museums. What a life. What a life. I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity. I'm very grateful for this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Flight Operations Group at the Society, I'd like to sincerely thank Paul for sharing some great memories of the remarkable man, Captain Winkle Brown. We're also very grateful that friends and family could join us for celebrating an amazing life in aviation. I didn't have the privilege of meeting Captain Brown myself, but he and his colleagues inspired me to join the profession. And I'll be eternally grateful. I feel I've been paid to do my hobby all my career. And I suppose it's our role now to inspire the next generation into our profession. And certainly Paul is doing an amazing job of that, keeping alive the history of aviation and the achievements of its pioneers. And again, I'd like you to join me in a sincere vote of thanks to Paul for sharing some amazing memories of a truly remarkable man.
Stand up.